previous stuff that needs more stuff. Okay, so let's start looking at our good dead friend Socrates, who did a lot of stuff, said a lot of stuff, then drank some hemlock and died. Now we saw last time that his view was that democracy is not to be trusted, although he decides to stay for the trial and drink the hemlock because he accepts, as we saw, the social contract theory, that we have an agreement that justifies the power of the state. So essentially we said we go along with it, so we gotta. And also natural law theory, the idea that beyond, above the laws that we make up, there's a objective moral assessment for those. And that, of course, these are important concepts even today because, at least in theory, the United States is based on both of these. That government is based on the consent of the governed, social contract, and that we have rights that don't come just from the state, but we get them from, endowed by our creator, etc. In terms of Plato's other contributions, or rather Socrates, he is, again, Plato's origin story, kind of like how the death of Bruce Wayne's parents creates Batman, the death of Socrates creates Plato. Also at a cave, not a bat cave, but a cave as we'll see. Also develops ethical theory, and his personality really shines through in dialogues, and people sometimes become interested in philosophy because they read about Socrates. And then of course he died. He's still dead today. A little background for our good dead friend Plato. Again, his origin story is the death of Socrates, and his overarching goal was to develop a society that was just and would not kill good people, because he was really upset by the death of Socrates. And he wrote a lot of stuff, and probably his best known work in this area is The Republic, a work on justice, trying to lay out what a perfect society would be like. He was born 428 or 427 BC, died 348 or 347, and of course is still dead today. He was born to an aristocratic family, pretty successful, and hung around with Socrates, got influenced by him. And in terms of his achievements, first, of course, is all the works, the dialogues that he wrote, leading some later philosophers, such as Alfred North Whitehead, to say that all of philosophy is but a footnote to Plato. And so he wrote a lot of stuff.
Why do they say, like, a guesstimate on when he lived and died?
Good question. I think they don't know for sure exactly. Or maybe I just screwed that up. But what I think is that they didn't have like his exact date, exact year. Or maybe he just faked his own death, like Elvis did. Yep, I said too much. Yeah, so he creates this great body of work on a huge range of topics in philosophy. And so one of his big deals is writing lots of stuff. The second thing, of course, is creating the famous Academy of Plato, from which we get our term academics, and of course, academy. And that originated because he built his school next to a grove of trees dedicated to the hero Academus. So if you ever wondered, like, why do we call it the academy, why do we call it academics? Well, because there was some Greek hero who died next to trees, and Plato built a school next to him, and so that's how we got it. If the hero had been named Bob, we'd be doing Bobademics, that would be Bobademy, which would be kind of weird, but would seem perfectly normal. Now, like many philosophers who have a vision of how the world should be, he tried to implement it. He tried to teach this ruler Dionysus the Younger to become a philosopher king, and like pretty much every philosopher, his attempts to do so turned disastrous. So much so they apparently had to flee to escape with his life because Dionysus was trying to kill him. And generally, if your students are trying to kill you, probably things are going. Actually, if anyone's trying to kill you, things are going bad, typically. And his views, were never put into place. Many other philosophers have tried to institute their views. In some cases, it just didn't work. They weren't terribly successful, like Confucius, or actively went disastrous, like with Plato. And maybe it's better that way. We now turn to the Apology, which is the subject of the paper. And so we'll start off with the apology and then jump to the apology of that paper. Now, in the trial, the way it works is this. The system is a trial by jury, and our system based on the English common law system, in a way can be traced back to that, where you have a trial, not with just like a judge, but you have a jury. In this case, they had the citizens of Athens, that's to say the free males who own the property, and what they would do is go through a two-stage process. First, there would be the person who's accused defending themselves against the accuser, and so no lawyers. And then secondly, once a verdict has been reached, there would be a proposal on the part of the accuser for a punishment, and then the accused, who has been found guilty, would propose a counter penalty, and that would be voted on. So it's a two-stage, basically, democratic trial done by voting. So Socrates is there charged with various strange charges, like inquiring the things above, the things below, trying to make the worse appear the better cause. Things would be really weird. I mean, it'd be weird to get like a ticket for inquiring to the things above today, or making the worse appear the better cause. Now, Socrates lays out kind of the real reason why he's probably there. As we saw before, his view of wisdom is that he knows nothing, and he was on a mission from the gods to prove this. But instead, he annoyed the politicians and showed that they knew nothing, the poets, the artisans, and concluded that his wisdom was knowing he knew nothing. But this, of course, antagonized those groups. And so they banded together and brought Socrates to trial. The ringleader of this group is Miletus, and he does the talking. Now, when reading through the Apology, it's important to note that it's written by Plato, who is very favorable to Socrates. So if you read through and think, wow, Miletus is making a lot of mistakes, I mean, maybe it's an accurate transcription of the trial, but we just have Plato's account. We don't have like the actual court transcription of what really occurred. Now, the main charge against Socrates is that he's a corrupter of the youth, a villainous misleader who teaches people, which for money, no crime, that he had no gods, but as we'll see, also charged with atheism, and making the worse appear the better cause. Now, for our purposes for the paper, our main concern will be the part about corruption. We'll flip to that in just a second. So his accusers are Miletus, representing the poets, the main talker, and Nitus, representing the craftsmen and politicians, and Lycon, the rhetoricians. And he has those charges against him. And now we switch to the paper PowerPoint. Well, not made of paper, made of digital stuff. So how do you do the paper? Well, it works like this. The reading is the apology, and the text of the apology is in the readings, but also for your convenience, if you go to the paper folder on Blackboard, it's in the paper guide. So all the stuff you need to do the paper in there, self-contained. The thesis of the paper is this. The purpose of this paper is to summarize and critically evaluate Socrates' horse trainer analogy and unintentional argument, which I refer to as the HTA and UA. The issue is this: do his arguments refute the corruption charges against him? Because there's the original charge that he is a corrupter, and then he modifies each charge. Modifies it first to him being the only corrupter, and then secondly to being an intentional corrupter. Now the paper is a 4-part paper, something I adopted years ago. You might have noticed that a lot of 4s going on. There's 4 main exams, 4 sections, 4 to the paper, 4 parts of the class, etc. Nothing special about 4. Just semesters divide more easily that way. So there's the introduction, summary, argument, and conclusion. Now in writing the paper, be sure to label the sections. One is it helps organize it. If you look at, say, professional writing, papers, they label the sections. That way you know like what's in there. Also for the grading part. When I grade it, each part is worth a certain number of points. And this way I know where you say, like, your introduction ends and your summary begins. So when I
So you're saying don't just write an introduction and have you assume just put introduction and then write it?
right. I mean, in a way, it may seem, kind of like obvious, just like, saying, and my introduction point, and then say introduction, my introduction.
So you kind of want this like APA format?
Kind of. Now, in terms of like the style for citing sources, I don't require that you learn like a whole new style just for one class. So whatever you normally use, MLA, I mean, I know all the styles and I recognize them, just use that one. If you don't have anyone to use, pick one. I would say if you're not sure, just use like Chicago, but any of the main, Chicago, both versions, MLA, APA, Tajin, etc., all acceptable. Now, yeah, so the other reason is for the points, and the basic idea is because that way I know like where the points, to be graded. Now, in many cases, if someone's a good writer, I can tell. They don't need the section things. Like they just clearly guide through the paper. Other cases, I'll be reading. I'm like, I don't know, I don't know where the summary begins, where this ends, because it's just going. Introduction, very straightforward. Worth 5 points. It should be 125 words or less, and mainly because it's only worth 5 points. You don't want to pour a ton of work into it for the 5 points. In terms of what should be in there, thesis statement, which you can copy right from the things. So that's, you don't have to cite it. It's just you can just copy that. Summary statement. You say in the summary, I will summarize blah blah. Position statement on the issue. Did the arguments refute the charges or not? Argument statement, you say what you're going to argue. Like, for example, you might say, I will assess the horse trainer analogy using the 3 standards of argument by analogy. Then I'll turn to assessing the unintentional argument, making use of an argument by example and an analogy. Whatever you're going to do. Minimal background is just to set the stage. Socrates is on trial, accused of various things. He was the teacher of Plato who wrote the Apology. If the 5 points are in there, 5 for 5. If less than 5. Now, since it's only worth 5 points, and this is pretty brief, you could actually do all this in like one run-on sentence, or maybe like 2 or 3 sentences. So it just needs to get this done. The current record for an introduction, I think, is about 6 or 7 pages. I'm just like reading, it's like, God. And at first I thought they just left the label off, but no, it was the intro. I'm like, oh God, what are you doing? You spent so much time on this. They did get the 5 points. What would have been worse is if they had 7 pages and they only got like one point, but they had the full 5. Yeah, so you want to keep this fairly brief. And the objective is basically to tell the reader what you're doing. Now, it's also a good approach in life. If you're speaking to people and want them to remember it, they often recommend what they used to call the Army method or the tell me 3 times method. So if you tell people what you're going to tell them what you told them, they're more likely to remember it. Because usually if you hear something once, like if someone tells you their name, like at a party or an event, you're like, oh, who was that person? But if you hear it like 3 times, and you notice people who are either experienced like communicators or experienced schmoozers, they'll always be sure to like give you their name, and then when they leave, they'll give you their name again, so it sticks. Because otherwise, you're like, was that Bob, Sally, Rapunzel? I don't know. Now the next part is 45 points, so big chunk of points. The objective here is this. There's part of the apology, so you don't have to do the whole apology, just the particular part we'll see in just a bit. The objective is to summarize the text clearly, concisely, accurately, in your own words. The clear part is quality of writing. So part of the grade rests on clarity. So that of course also ties into other stuff as well, because if it's like really unclear and just terrible, even if it's like somehow like something brilliant in there, it's kind of hard to see. So this is a matter of the quality of the presentation. Conciseness is also important because a summary should be shorter than what it's summarizing. Otherwise, you might as well just read the original. Accuracy, of course, is also important because the goal of the summary is not to present like, alternative facts or fake news about what's going on. Well, that'd be a funny paper. Fake news Socrates. Actually, that's not a bad idea. The accurate part, of course, is important. And the in your own words part, of course, is what separates it from just being quoting or, worse, plagiarism. Now, it may seem like something easy to do. All you gotta do is say what's already been said, how hard can that be? Now, the challenge is, of course, putting it into your own words. And it's actually surprisingly difficult because the skill of a summary involves doing this. First, reading the original, determining what's important in it and what's not, and then conveying it to someone else accurately, correctly, and concisely in your own words. Now, the skill is useful, obviously, for the paper, because it's a paper, but also throughout life. Even before we were in the information age, and now it's all information, being able to get information, distill it down to the essentials, know what's going on, convey it to others, really useful skill. So no matter what field you go on professionally, unless your profession is like hermit, you're going to have to use that skill, be it in business or medicine or whatever. So being able to read things, listen to things, condense it down to the important bits, convey it to others, very useful skill. So what's going to be in the summary? Well, one of the ways, if you have to do a summary, or if you convey really important information, like stuff really matters, is creating an outline. Because what you do when you're outlining something is you're trying to extract the essentials. Now, I've done the outline already, and so it lays out all the important stuff. Now, the judgment call you have to make is, do you want to take like the super safe approach and just include every single point? Because I include every single every single thing that's said pretty much. Or do you want to gamble a bit and try to, see like what should be in there and emphasized and what should be left out? Because the outline doesn't put any emphasis on, aside from like it being, like a bigger level, doesn't put any more or less emphasis on stuff. So kind of the challenge here, I've done the outline, what kind of your challenge is trying to decide like what is the important stuff I should focus on and what kind of stuff is maybe less important. But again, the safe approach is just, okay, I'm just gonna grind through this, everything is gonna be in there. And that's a safe approach, but then again, it's kind of just grinding out, putting in just everything. So here's what should be in there. First, you gotta let the reader know what are the charges. And Socrates has been charged with two things. We'll only focus on one though. Thing one is, he's a doer of evil who corrupts the youth. And that's the thing we'll focus on. Thing two, which we'll see when we get out of talking about the paper, and it won't be in the paper, is that he doesn't believe in the gods of the state, but as his own divinities. Now Socrates then turns to this point. He is going to try to show that it is not he, Socrates, that is the corrupter, rather it is his accuser, Miletus, who is a doer of evil, who is a mere pretender, and what motivates Miletus is not the youth, but he just wants to bring Socrates to trial. He then engages the Socratic method, and he says Miletus claims to have done all this thinking about the youth, because he claims to know so much, so he brought Socrates to trial because he wants to protect the youth. So he infers that Miletus surely would know, if he knows who corrupts the youth, surely he would know who benefits them. So he asks Miletus to tell the judges, who is it that benefits the youth? And he goes through a series of questions asking basically to the judges, to the citizens, etc. And the end result is this. According to Miletus, everybody in Athens, except Socrates, benefits the youth. Socrates is the sole corrupter. And so what he's done here is he's gotten Miletus to modify the charge. Because the original charge is he's a corrupter. But then he goes through the Socratic method here, questioning him, narrowing it down, and gets Miletus to say that he is the only corrupter. So not just a corrupter, but the only one. Before we go on to our next exciting slide, anything about this that needs more stuff? Now at this point he brings up the horse trainer analogy. And of course this is an analogy. So if you're wondering why we talked about analogies before, I mentioned that because of the horse trainer analogy and the prophecy has been fulfilled, here is the HTA. So this is what Socrates does. He picks horses because the people he's talking to, the free property owners of Athens, would know horses. Just like today, if you were doing an analogy and you wanted to pick something that you're sure pretty much everyone you're talking to would know about, you'd probably pick like a smartphone, because almost everyone's got one and knows about it. So they picked horses, the smartphones of the past. Well, not really. They're kind of the cars of the past. So he argues like this. In the case of horses, he claims, there's one person, the trainer, who has knowledge, who can benefit the horses. Other people, the many, who lack knowledge, would harm the horses. Perhaps not intentionally, but they don't know what they're doing. And he claims, and this is how he makes the analogy, this is true of horses, but it's true by analogy of all other animals. And most importantly for his argument, the youth. Then he says the youth would be very happy, very well off, if they just had one person corrupting them and everyone else improving them. Things would be great. But Socrates claims that's clearly not the case, because in the case of the horses, it's the exact opposite. Many people have no idea what they're doing, so they're likely to harm the horse, and the people who know are few in number. And so he concludes that, first, that he's not the sole corrupter, but also he takes a shot at Miletus. That Miletus, he claims, has not thought about the youth at all. He's just here, to get Socrates. So the analogy, badly drawn, works like this. So in the analogy, you've got the horse trainer, and you have the many. And then you got the horses, which I know look like people stick figures. But, yeah. Horse. So what Socrates is saying is, when he's running the analogy, is the horse trainer, the one who has knowledge, who knows stuff, they benefit the horses because they have knowledge. The many who lack knowledge, they would harm the horses because they lack knowledge. Now it says by analogy, in the analogy of course, the many are still the many. The horses, the analogy, would be replaced by the youth. And the horse trainer, well, Socrates seems to clearly be implying that he is the horse trainer. But he doesn't actually say it. He doesn't say, I am the horse trainer, I am the one. So the horse trainer is possibly Socrates, although he doesn't actually come out and make that claim, but seems to be implied. And so the key question, the one that we dealt with in the argument section is he right about that? Is this scenario, horse trainer benefits horses, people of knowledge, they're few in number, the many who are ignorant harm the horses, they're many in number and they're ignorant, does that apply? Does the analogy work? And that's the objective of part of the argument section. But that's how his argument goes. And so he concludes that since this is true of the horses, by analogy, it's true of the youth, and by the way, Miletus, hasn't thought about this because he would have got it if he did.
So with the paper, we're basically saying whether we agree with Socrates being like a horse trainer or not.
And you can take that approach. And as we'll see in the argument section, the main question for this argument is he right? Does this analogy, is it strong or weak? Okay, before moving to the unintentional argument, anything about the HTA, or how to draw horses really badly? That's what my cats and dogs also look like too, so. And lions, and yeah, pretty much everything. Unintentional argument, or UA. Now, once again, so he runs Miletus through the horse train analogy, and then he puts Miletus through the grinder again. He says to Miletus, goes again through a series of questions. And Miletus doesn't realize that as he answers these, just like before, he's setting himself up. So Socrates asks, question after question after question, and the end result is this. Miletus agrees to the following. First, it's better to live among good people than bad people. Why? Well, because good people do good stuff, and bad people do bad stuff. And no one would rather be injured than benefited, because no one wants to be hurt. And Miletus agrees to all of this. Then Socrates gets Miletus to modify the charge. So he asks Miletus, did I do this corruption intentionally or not? And Miletus says, intentional. So the charge is switched from corrupter to sole corrupter, and then now to intentional corrupter. So Miletus modifies the charge twice. Now he then asks Miletus, who does good and who does evil? And Miletus, of course, is to say, well, obviously the good do good, the evil do evil. And this is the crux, the key, the soul, the heart, the brain of Socrates' argument. Socrates says that he knows this. If he makes the people around him worse, he corrupts them and makes them bad, then they'll become bad people, and they'll probably harm him. And he knows this. And assuming that Socrates, is not irrational, either he doesn't corrupt them, because corrupting them would be stupid, because he'd be hurting himself, or he does so without knowing it, without intent. Because given that he knows that if he corrupted them, they'd probably hurt him, then he wouldn't do that intentionally. So, at worst, he's an unintentional corrupter. Now, one thing that people often do is say that Socrates is arguing that they didn't hurt him, so he didn't corrupt them. But he doesn't actually make that argument. He doesn't say, they didn't hurt me, so I didn't corrupt them. He's arguing that, not that, he's arguing that he wouldn't corrupt them, because if he did, they'd probably hurt him. Or, so he doesn't do it or doesn't do it intentionally. And so he draws, two conclusions. One is one that's actually supported by the argument, which is he claims either he's not a corrupter, or, and hence innocent, or didn't do so intentionally, and hence is not an intentional corrupter. And then he turns against Miletus again. He says, either way, Miletus is lying. He's not an intentional corrupter. And he, chides Miletus, saying that if he, was corrupting the youth unintentionally, Miletus should have taken him aside and corrected him, but instead he's taking him to court, which is a place of punishment. So clearly he says Miletus doesn't care about the youth, he's just here to get Socrates. So those are the three things to have in the summary. The charge, the main charge, corrupter of the youth, the horse trainer analogy, and the unintentional argument. So how's the summary graded? Well, it's based on going back to the objectives. There's the quality of the writing, how clearly it's presented, how well organized it is, all that stylistic stuff. There's also, of course, the, how concise it is, how accurate it is, how well it presents it. So, like an A summary would contain all the essential details and convey them in a very clear, organized manner, so that a person reading would say, aha, I know exactly what's going on. And then, of course, like a B would do.
So, unintentional argument, it's really, so it's, he's trying to turn it around on Miletus to get everyone else to see that it's more personal than political?
Yeah, because what he's got two goals in a way. One is he's trying to show that Miletus's argument or his claim doesn't work. That Miletus says you're an intentional corrupter, and Socrates says, no, I can't be because I know better. And then his other point is to try to show that Miletus he's not concerned about the youth. Miletus is just here to get Socrates. Yeah, so he's trying to refute Miletus and show Miletus is the bad guy. Because Miletus is there professing to be like this great champion of the youth and just concerned about the youth, and Socrates is like, no, you're just here to get me. Argument part. Now the argument section is worth 45 points, and so, same as the summary. There's basically three main things going on in the argument section. First, stating the position. Secondly, assessing the horse trainer analogy. Thirdly, the unintentional argument. Now, you'll begin with stating your position. Now, there are in total 6 positions in here. You could take the same answer to all 6, but there are 6 positions. Now, this seems like a lot of stuff, namely like 6. But actually, you can do all your position statements in 2 short sentences, or 1 run-on sentence, or you throw like a semicolon in there. So the first issue is this: does the horse trader analogy succeed as an analogy? Is it strong or weak? And the answer is yes or no. Secondly, does it refute the original charge? The original charge is he is a corrupter, and that's yes or no. Thirdly, does it refute the modified charge, which is he is the sole corrupter, the only corrupter. And again, that's a lot, 3 separate issues, but you can do it in 1 sentence. You could say, is my position the horse trainer analogy is a strong analogy, although it does not refute the original charge, it does refute the modified charge. Or you might say, is my position the horse trainer analogy is a weak analogy, so it refutes neither charge, or whatever your position might be. Again, you can handle all 3 of those points in just 1 sentence. The next 3 are the same basic deal for the unintentional argument. Is it a good argument? Does it refute the original charge that he's a corrupter? And does it refute the modified charge that he is an intentional corrupter? And again, this can be done in a single sentence. It is my view that the unintentional argument is successful as an argument, although it does not refute the original charge, it does refute the modified charge. Or you might say, it is my view the unintentional argument fails, therefore refutes neither charge. And done. Now the reason you want to put your position out there at the start, again, is clarity. Because the idea of being a clear communicator is you always want people to know what you're saying, what your position is, and where you're going with your stuff. Before going to the HTA, anything about this that needs more stuff? Now, assessing it takes us back to the ancient days of, a while ago. This, of course, is an argument by analogy. So the form is, as we saw before. In this case, we have the horses have, the idea is that horses have certain qualities, the youth have certain qualities. The horses have the quality of being corrupted by the many who lack knowledge and benefited by the few who have knowledge. And Socrates reasons that the same is true of the youth. So the question is the horse trainer analogy strong or weak? How do you tell? Well, apply the 3 standards. Now, one way to make the paper very well organized and focused is just explicitly use these 3 standards. And they are the number of properties they have in common, the relevance of the shared properties, and are there any dissimilarities. And you can also be like somewhat less formal and say, you know, the argument comes down to, are they alike enough in enough ways? But you'll need to include either, you know, formally or informally the three standards. And again, one very precise way to do it, make sure you cover everything, is just say, begin, do they have enough in common? Yes or no, you know, why or why not? Are the qualities they share relevant to being corrupted or not corrupted? Yes or no, why or why not? Are there relevant differences? Yes or no, why or why not?
So the X and Y would be like the HTA and then the U and comparing them.
Yeah, the whole thing would be the comparison of, the X would be the horses, you know, and the Y are the youth. So Socrates is basically saying the youth and the horses are alike. The horses have the property that they're corrupted by people who don't have knowledge, who are many, benefited by the few who have knowledge, or the one who has knowledge. Therefore, the same is true of the youth. So horses are like youth. Horses are corrupted by the many who lack knowledge, benefited by the few who have knowledge. So the same is true of the youth. And so to assess it, you're basically looking at this. Are the horses and the youth enough alike? Is training horses like training the youth? So, I mean, one way is like to give like a hint if you think maybe he's wrong, what you might say is there is an important difference. Like one relevant difference would be when you have humans training horses, the horses are a different species, and they're being trained to do things they wouldn't normally do, like being ridden, pulling carts, etc. So if you have, you know, in that case, clearly someone who, you know, doesn't know about horses is not going to do a great job because they have no idea what they're doing. But in the case of the youth, it's, you know, same species. You know, so in the case of like parents, parents generally do it, for the most part, you know, do a decent job raising their kids, even though they have no clue initially. And so you could say, well, that in the case of, you know, humans raising humans, you don't need a specialized, you know, kid trainer initially, you know. Likewise with horses out in the wild, they don't have like a special horse training horse that, you know, trains the horses. They learn from other horses. So you could say that the situation is different because of the different species. Or if you agree with them, you could argue that, you know, true, they're different species, but the scenario is more like, you know, teaching. That if you have someone trying to teach like math, then, and they have no idea about math, they're like, yeah, 2 + 2, that's 7 or something, and triangles, they got, you know, 8 sides. So if you have someone who doesn't know stuff, they're going to do a terrible job teaching. And so you could argue either way. And I intentionally picked this because you could argue, there are good reasons to think it's a strong argument, but also good reason to think that it's a weak argument. There's no like correct option here. Okay, before going to the unintentional argument, or before going to the final part of the HTA, anything about this? Now, once you've assessed the argument, decide if it's strong or weak, the final thing to do for the HTA is this. Does it refute the original charge, that he's the corrupter, and does it refute the modified charge, that he's the sole corrupter? Now, with the original charge, you have, you know, the options are yeah, no, for both of these. Now, if you think the argument failed, if you end up saying the argument is weak, then your answer is no to both. You just simply say, I've shown the argument to be a weak argument by analogy. A weak argument cannot refute either charge, so it failed. Done. Now, if you think the argument was a strong argument by analogy, you could still say it doesn't refute the original charge, because Socrates doesn't actually say that he's the horse trainer. So it leaves open the possibility that he could be among the many. So maybe he still is a corrupter, but he couldn't be the sole corrupter if the argument is strong. Now, you could argue that Socrates clearly implies that he is the horse trainer. And So if that's plausible, then you would say that it does, on the assumption that Socrates is a horse trainer, if the argument is strong, then it does refute the original charge. Now, for the modified charge, you would just say, if you have shown the argument to be strong, you'd say, well, I've shown the argument by a horse trainer analogy to be a strong argument. It shows that, Socrates cannot be the sole corrupter, there'd be many corruptors, so it refutes the modified charge. And done. Then the next thing is the unintentional argument. Now, much of the unintentional argument is pretty clearly true. And when arguing philosophically, or arguing anything, it's fair, reasonable in fact, to not fight every single point when the points are quite reasonable. So for example, like in a legal case, the defense and prosecution may agree on certain things that are established, that knives hurt people, for example. Likewise, in this case, instead of arguing every single point, you can reasonably focus on like a key point. So the idea that good people do good, yeah, that's pretty much by definition. That bad people do bad, yeah, because if they're doing, if a person is doing all kinds of good stuff and that's all they do, then they're not really bad anymore. And the people don't want to be harmed, well, yeah, that seems, all that seems reasonable. So the real focus of the fight is on the key premise. Now, if you want to, you could assess every single premise, but most of them are just, you can kind of prove them in just a single step, like good people do good. Well, yes, just as tennis players play tennis, by definition, that's what good people do. So the key premise is this, that if he corrupts, then he's likely to be harmed, because his argument hinges on that. Because he essentially says, well, if I corrupt these youth, they'll probably hurt me, I don't want to be hurt, so I'm not going to corrupt them intentionally. Now, if you think this is plausible, true or at least plausible, then you'd agree with Socrates. If you think that it's untrue or at least implausible, then you disagree. So how do you assess it? How do you show whether it's probably true or probably false? Well, one option is this, and you can use other options, but these are two hints. One is argument by example. You can find historical examples where, if you agree with Socrates, where people corrupted other people and came to, bad ends. That the people they corrupted ended up turning on them and betraying them. And you can look at, obviously, like, criminals, in politics, political, especially like in revolutions, etc. A good example is like the French Revolution, where they're just like killing everybody. The revolution like devoured everybody. Or if you think Socrates is wrong, find historical examples where people corrupted their followers, like for example Stalin, and their followers never turned them. They were unharmed by them. And again, I intentionally picked it so you could argue reasonably either way, because the examples, for and against. Now you can also use, and people often like to do this, is use fictional examples, books and movies. Now the weak point of a fictional example is, of course, it's fictional. It goes the way it goes because the writer says so. It's like, asking the question, why did events in, Avengers, play out that way? Well, because it's in the script. That's always the answer. Why did that happen? The answer is always it's in the script. So when you use fictional examples, the weak point is it's fictional. But you can use them as sort of an argument by intuition. In that case, they're not like things that really have happened, but people may feel like, okay, yeah, that's plausible. They can think of like a movie or a book where someone, corrupts people and is not harmed by them, or corrupts people and they turn against them. Then you could say, well, even though this is not real, you should still see this as a plausible story, so accept it as true. It's like argument by fictional example. You can also, if you want to like double down on analogies, you can assess the argument using an analogy. And I'll give, well, you use the dog trainer analogy with the dogs, already drawn up. Now you could say, imagine someone who's trying to get their dog to be a vicious killing machine. Well, their dog might turn on them and end up hurting them. For example, first time I ever saw a pit bull, remember vividly, long ago. I was running in San Luis Park, and I saw 3 people trying to get their dogs to fight. This one guy's like whipping the hell out of his pit bull. And I'm looking at the dog, and I'm like, that's probably a bad idea. And sure enough, the dog like jumps up and takes a chunk out of his butt. So there's probably some guy wandering around Tallahassee, known as like Johnny One Butt to this day. And so, harming his dog, ended up corrupting the dog, but the dog turned against him. Now you can also have an analogy where the opposite happens. Someone turns their dog into like a killing machine. For example, a friend of mine, he knew someone an ex-police officer who had like an ex-police dog, and the dog had steel teeth, for real, like steel cat teeth, so I guess it could like violate people's civil rights even harder or something. And the dog would like murder anybody but that one guy, the one person. He would like try to kill everybody except for him. And so the dog, you'd say, was kind of corrupted because it was a killing machine with steel teeth, but not that one person. So people could make their dog into a killing machine that kills everybody but them. Maybe an argument by analogy supporting, going against Socrates. Now you'd also, of course, want to assess, so assuming, if you think that it's plausible, the premise is plausible, is he therefore right? That he didn't, therefore he wasn't a corrupter? And the answer would be, well, yeah, if this is probably true, then Socrates, pretty reasonable as he established, people generally don't want to be harmed, so it would follow that he probably wouldn't do corruption. Like for example, if someone knows that setting their house on fire would destroy their house, while they're in it, kill them while they're in it, and they don't want to be killed, they probably wouldn't burn their house down. So, yeah, in that case, probably reasonable. Now, the final step here is, does it respond to the charges? Now, the original charge, Ian, is that he is a corrupter. Now, the answer here is, the argument probably doesn't do that, because if it succeeds, the argument shows that either he didn't corrupt or he did so unintentionally, which still leaves the possibility open that he did corrupt, although unintentionally. Now, if you think the argument was a good argument, you would say it does refute the modified charge, because the argument, its conclusion is he didn't do it intentionally or he didn't do it. So he couldn't, if the argument works, if it's a strong argument, then he would refute the charge. If you think the argument failed, you would say, well, a failed argument can't refute the charge, it refutes neither of them, so done. Now the final thing, conclusion. 5 points, 105 words or less, and good bit of advice is just, copy, paste your introduction, and you just make 2 changes. One, you go from, if you're using the future tense, like I will, you change it to the past tense, like I argued that, as opposed to I will argue. And then you swap out the relevant background with some final remark, like, and Socrates died, and he still dead today, but people still write papers about him. Damn you, Socrates, and your paper writing stuff, or whatever you want to say. Okay, so that's the end of the paper. In terms of the resources for the paper, if you go on Blackboard, there is the paper guide, which has got all the stuff in there. It goes through like exactly how to write the paper. It has the stuff, it has the reading for the paper, that section. It has the outline of it. It has a complete sample paper, how it's graded, all that stuff. Okay, so next time on the Monday, we'll press on with the apology and more stuff. So there we go.